So what we have here on the right is a color photo of the number 3 hydria on the reverse side. And it depicts Eos, the goddess, chasing Kephalos, who's fleeing on the left. And my topic today on this slide, is to show you, at least a initial comparison with Ravana approaching Sita on the Caeretan hydria number 2. So the number 3 hydria that you see on the right, it contains a depiction of Eos, the winged goddess, and Kephalos on the reverse side. And on the front side, the main scene that you see is Apollo and Hermes and the stealing of the cattle. So Hermes is in the cradle and Apollo is questioning why his cattle have been stolen. So they seem to be totally unrelated in some ways on the surface, those two scenes. But getting back to this hydria overall, this number 3 hydria is in the same group as number 2 hydria of the so-called satyrs chasing Maeonids, which is called Group A, according to Jaap Hemmelreich. And the similarities between the abduction and pursuit scenes in the number 2 and number 3 hydriae, along with the examples from Silenus in the previous slide, certainly indicate that they are both mythological scenes with named characters, meaning that the number 3 hydriae has many mythological characters that we can name, but the number 2 hydria should have the same. It should also have mythological characters that we can name, because they both have very strong similarities in terms of the abduction and pursuit. And finally, the quote from Hemmelreich I will give you is that gods are restricted to Group A, which is what number 2 and number 3 are a part of, and females are plentiful in Group A and rare in Group B. There is not a single vague scene in Group A, according to Hemmelreich. But in his opinion, the identification of Eos and Kephalos on the reverse of number 3 has sometimes been doubted. There cannot be any doubt, however, that Group A generally represents an earlier phase than Group B. So he's definitely acknowledging that Group A is an older set of vases than Group B, and that number 2 and number 3 are a part of Group A. He's also acknowledging that gods are restricted to Group A. And so therefore we should expect to find not only mythological heroes on number 2 and number 3, but also heroes that are divine. And that's what Rama is. He's a divine hero, just like Apollo or Heracles. And he also admits that females are plentiful in Group A. So clearly, if we can name Eos or Maia, the mother of Hermes or Apollo, on the front side of the number 3, then we can also name Sita on the number 2 hydria. So now I just want to make a comparison systematically between the story of Eos and Kephalos and the story of Ravana and Sita. And the comparison will span both the scenes on the painted hydriae as well as the sculptures from Silenus. So the first point is that Ravana grabs Sita to prevent her escape in the Caeretan hydria, and Eos does the same with Kephalos on the altar's carved sculpture at Silenus. And the next point is that Sita flees in the opposite direction while still facing Ravana in fear. Kephalos turns away to flee from Eos while still looking back at her in the limestone metope as well. So you can see the similarities already in those 2 points. And then both scenes are sexual conquests through forced abduction, and they date from the same time period as well. Late 6th century BC to early 5th century, so circa 530 to 470 BCE. So they're roughly from the same time period as well. And another point is that it is illogical to claim that one is a mythological scene with characters that can be explicitly named, and the other is somehow just some generic scene with no personalized figures. And that's what they seem to conclude for the Caeretan hydria, which makes no sense at all for the Boston hydria, the Caeretan hydria number 2, that is. So, yeah, they're able to positively identify the scene of Eos and Kephalos, or at least they have, they make a conjecture about it, or they have a strong belief that it might be. But with the other scene from Boston, they just simply want to stick to the belief that it's generic somehow, and when that just does not make any sense. And lastly, both events occur when the victim or the victim's husband is out hunting, quote unquote, as if to metaphorically tell us that the hunter has now become the hunted. Remember that the youthful lady Sita implores her husband Rama to hunt the golden deer in the Valmiki Ramayana, but instead Ravana hunts her down. Similarly, Kephalos is said to have been chased down by Eos when he was hunting outside. So, and you can see the source Apollodorus 1.9.4. You can also look at the story of Atlanta for another similar theme of the hunter becoming the hunted. So this really, systematically proves that these two stories are very, very similar, and therefore are very, useful for our analysis here. The image you see on the right is of the front side of the Caeretan hydria in the Louvre, which is the famous Cradle of Hermes in the book of Raffaella Bonato. She uses the title of this particular hydria, where Apollo complains to Maia, the mother of Hermes, about his stolen cattle, while Hermes sleeps in the cradle. And so the naughty Hermes has stolen Apollo's cattle and has hidden them in a thicket of leaves that you see on the left near a cave, an entrance to a cave. So it's an interesting scene that you can look at right here on the right, and it has a lot of different things going on, and it's quite complex, and it's actually really a connected narrative of two different scenes or two different events happening at the same time, sort of like Sita's abduction and the deer hunt of Rama. And the dividing line is really just the branches and the roots of the leaves. They act as sort of an artistic dividing line between the two scenes. So this is the tale, the famous tale in the Greek myth of the dispute between Apollo and Hermes, where Hermes covets Apollo's sacred cattle. And eventually, Apollo and Hermes do settle their dispute, because Apollo receives a magical musical instrument from Hermes, the lyre, and Hermes receives the entire herd of Apollo's cattle. So, in this story, on this front side of the Caeretan hydria number 3, we have a situation where both characters end up satisfied, which is quite different from the result on the number 2 Boston hydria, where only evil Ravana is satisfied or successful at the end of the episode of abduction of Sita. And if we look at number 3, you have to remember that the backside, or the reverse side, is the pursuit of Kephalos by Eos. And so if we keep that in mind, we can continue to see some comparisons between number 3 and number 2 in terms of the abductions. In the Greek story of Eos and Kephalos, which is not actually depicted on the hydria itself, Kephalos is forced later on to accept Eos's sexual advances, and they have a son named Phaeton. But he eventually returns to his wife Procris, who has become estranged from him. And similarly, Rama and Sita eventually reunite after her abduction by Ravana, but become estranged soon afterwards, when Rama banishes Sita from his kingdom under suspicion of infidelity. So there is this black cloud of suspicion that hangs over the abducted Sita and Kephalos when they come back to meet their spouses and reunite with their spouses. And so that's another point of comparison or symmetry between these two myths of Eos and Kephalos and Rama and Sita, or Ravana and Sita. So it's just very interesting that you can see a lot of parallels, and that's why it's great for comparison. These two hydria, number 3 and number 2.